Hello everybody, Master Mason Michael here. There are real secrets in the world. And Masonry, I contend, holds three key secrets about humanity close to its bosom. They have to do with who we really are, where we came from, and a lost technology that was used to build megalithic stone buildings that we see around the planet. I like looking at the oldest documents we have in Masonry because I feel that the further back we look, the closer we might get to clues to what Freemasonry is really all about. Clearly today, for most Masons, it's, well, I like to say today, it's kind of looks like a club for social misfits. But, largely it's good men who seek to be better men and join Masonry for its fraternal aspects, and a lot of people that join enjoy memorizing. In fact, if you join Masonry, it's hoped that you have some capability for memorizing, because there's a lot of that involved. Well, only for those who choose to enter the line, go up the line, become master of a lodge, which I've done 4 times now. I like memorizing. I know a number of half-hour long lectures by heart. But when we look to our oldest documents, I kind of wonder that maybe it's possible that instead of Masonry holding secrets about our past, maybe it serves to hide secrets, hide a particular secret. I call it a forgetting mechanism. Those of you that might follow the history researchers that study the fields that go by the name Tartaria, not that necessarily the preceding civilization was entirely Tartarian, it's just a term that under which a big bulk of current historical research is occurring under. Those of you who might have been exposed to the area of research called the mud flood is another related set of topics. Not that anybody thinks that the last cataclysm was actually a flood of mud, and it doesn't look like it was a liquefaction event, because liquefaction creates crooked buildings, but clearly something happened. And just to interrupt myself for a minute as a little aside, if you haven't been exposed to that subject, what I'm talking about is there's evidence in cities around the world of some big dumping of dirt that happened. We see, for example, in San Francisco, I am in Northern California, so I have seen this. I've been to San Francisco many times over the course of my life, and we see buildings that were built in the 1800s buried at the top of the first floor in dirt, and they either cut pathways down to the original front door, or they abandoned the original front door and built stairs up to a second floor window where they put in a door. We see this in Cincinnati, in London, in Moscow, and indeed all across the realm. And historians tell us this is because of, they call it cultural layers, that people were too lazy to sweep the sidewalks, so the dirt built up 10 feet deep. And nobody actually believes that anymore now that people are actually looking at it. And there are YouTube channels where people have made a hobby of going into these so-called basements and filming the original front door and front room windows 10 feet underground. What happened? It's been completely written out of our history. So there seems to be evidence to suggest that cathedrals and mosques were originally power stations, the old cathedrals, the megalithic type, with dozens or more of super tall steeples with non-Christian crosses on top, with metal fingers and metal balls and wires in many cases still running from those crosses down inside the steeples, connecting to interlocking metal floor plates, chimatic rose symbols in the front of the buildings that are now recognized to be chimatic frequency signatures of the frequency of electricity that was being generated in these buildings. I suggest that early Catholic women who wore shawls over their hair did so to keep their hair down, because when they entered this highly electrified environment, their hair would stand up. And this has not only been written out of our history, but we were taught a new history involving that these weren't power stations, that these were so-called places of worship. So I call all this, it's my own term, I haven't heard anybody else use it, but I call it a forgetting mechanism that exists on the planet. There's much more to say on this. I just briefly want to touch on it. If you've been exposed to it, you know what I'm talking about. And I wonder, maybe that Freemasonry might also be a part of this forgetting mechanism. Rather than hiding real secrets about our past and who we are, well, it would be hiding real secrets, but in a different way, rather than hiding secrets that we could discover in our ritual and in our symbols and iconography. That maybe it hides a secret of our past by obfuscation, by creating something that looks mysterious, that borrows from all these ancient mystery school traditions to make us think that it's quasi-spiritual and quasi-historic, but actually is just another sucker hole, if you will, kind of like some people suggest that religion might be a way to hide our true nature and who we really are, and to hide our real past. Now, I frankly don't think this, although my mind is open, but I think that maybe if this occurred, and I'm pretty sure it did, at the time when our history was being rewritten and people were being thrown into insane asylums that refused to go along with the new paradigm, and new books were being written as our old history was being burned, that maybe there are a group of learned men who built Freemasonry as a message in a bottle, if you will, as a way to hide our real past and our real history in plain sight, and veiled in allegory and symbols of our gentle craft of Masonry. Now, if that's the case, they did such a good job that, well, they probably knew what it all meant, but now today it's not so obvious. So there's scholars like myself that look at Freemasonry very closely, at our symbols and what they mean, at our ritual and the words used, and most interestingly, at our oldest documents. So I have here a collection of Mackey's Revised History of Freemasonry. I have a set of the 7 volumes. My set, let me just open this carefully. It's really beautiful with gold gilt-edged pages and I suppose relatively acid-free paper. The paper has yellowed a bit with age, but is holding up really well. As I turn the pages here to get to the copyright date, let me show you this interesting picture, because this gets to the history hiding thing. So here, let me just hold this up for the camera, and it's a depiction of people in front of a megalithic ancient stone building with arches, and they are working it with chisels and wood hammers, which today's researchers don't believe happened at all. When we look at megalithic stone buildings, we see evidence of a high heat being used, of laser precision tools. We see evidence of rotary tools being used, and reciprocating saws, and evidence of other mysterious mechanical methods of working stone that we don't know what they were today. It's also interesting that we see in this picture that one fellow is measuring the side of this building, and is he a giant? I mean, he's standing next to this building with giant arches in it, and the whole idea of there being giants in our past is also one of these mysteries that is being looked at very closely by today's researchers. So I think that's kind of interesting also. But here, let me just keep turning this. That page is super thick. I mean, thicker than today's cardstock with the picture on it. So here we are. This is the new revised enlarged version of Mackey's History of Freemasonry, revised by Robert Ingham Clegg, 33rd degree. Now this makes me think of I was going to look up his name, make sure I don't get it wrong, which I probably will, but Scaligerian history is, I believe, what it's called, is basically the ancient history that we're taught in school. All the original books were long since destroyed, and Scaliger and his team of monks copied all these old books. And in fact, at the beginning of their copied books, and many of them, the first part of the book says that, you know, they're the Scaligerian monks or whatever monks they were, and that they're rewriting the old books and correcting the mistakes. Like, what kind of corrections were they doing? Like making it up out of whole cloth, and then burning the originals to present us with a new history. It seems like this rewriting of history has probably occurred many times. Anyway, to continue, so, you know, what did the original Mackey book say? Who knows? This guy Robert Clegg revised and rewrote them, with the cooperation of many eminent authorities, including William James Hugan. I think this is interesting. He's a past senior Grand Deacon of the Grand Lodge of England, past senior Grand Warden of Egypt, past senior Grand Warden of Iowa, etc. Well, if you get as far as senior warden, your next year is master. Did he not complete his journey to the east? Or if he did, why do they not brag about the fact that he was past master of these eminent bodies? So that's kind of a curiosity. Let me just get to the date of this. So the first publication was 1898. Mine is 1921. 1898 is right there in the middle of the most recent rewriting of our history. Most researchers today think that the last cataclysm happened in 1845 to 1850, in that kind of range. Some people suggest that it happened in 1792 and the cleanup finished in 1845, but I lean more on the 1845-ish date for the last cataclysm, just by nature of the age of the buildings that we see that were buried in what's being called the mud flood. And just as an aside, again, I'm sorry, but you know, like I said, it wasn't a liquefaction event because that creates crooked buildings. These are buildings that are buried in dirt. Nor does it appear to actually have been a flood of mud, because those kind of events have a unique appearance also. It almost looks more like dirt was just dumped on the planet in different spots. For example, the sod houses of the early American plains. We're taught in school that they didn't have any wood, so they cut chunks of sod and built their houses out of them. But when we look at photos from the era of this, with this new mindset, what they look like is ramshackle, simple stick buildings that had a bunch of dirt dumped on them, and they're kind of falling in and falling apart from the weight of it. So this dumping of dirt, while it wasn't universal all around the globe, everywhere, it kind of was like dropped in different places. I'm here in Northern California, and there's an area near Napa called Jameson Canyon. And when you drive through there, they're hills, rounded shaped hills, all lawn, and the highway runs through the bottom part of these hills. And the hills have transient soils. You can see all over where big chunks of hillsides are just slipping down. And it seems like if those hills were millennia old, the dirt would have slumped off of them down to bedrock long ago. And yet these hills seem like they're fairly fresh, with the dirt still sliding off of fresh dumping. So anyway, it's just my own observation. I don't know how much validity it has. I'm not a geologist, but it's just curious when we open our eyes and look around with this new understanding. So anyway, I just Well, I've already rattled on a little bit too long. I wanted to talk about this a little bit, this first chapter of this book, because I think it might be pointing to a hiding of history right in the very first pages of this 1898 book. The front page says, the Masonic History Company provides light and proficiency, or maybe it's providing darkness, a little hard to tell. So let me skip here the preface, because that is by Robert Clegg, who rewrote the original books, although he says in the preface that there are a number of people that provided content for the first edition that Mackey wrote, and concurred that this rewrite and a little bit of I guess they made things a little more concise, that they agreed that it still presented the proper message. So let's assume that Clegg held true to the original form of the book. So here, Chapter 1, A Tradition in History and Masonry. In the study of Freemasonry, there are two kinds of statements presented to the mind of the student. These are sometimes in agreement, but much oftener conflicting in their character. These are the historical and the traditional, each of which belongs to Freemasonry, but each considers it from a different angle. The historical statement relates to the institution as we look at it from an exoteric or public point of view. The traditional refers only to its esoteric or secret character. So long as its traditional legends are confined to the ritual of the order, they are not fit subjects of historical inquiry. They have been invented by the makers of the rituals for symbolic purposes connected with the forms of initiation. Out of these myths of speculative masonry, its philosophy has developed. As they are really to be considered as merely the expansion of a philosophical or speculative idea, they cannot properly be placed in the class of recorded events, historical narratives. But in the published works of those who have written on the origin and progress of Masonry, the legendary or traditional has been mingled too much with this historical element. The effect of this course has been on critical minds to weaken all claims of the institution to an historical existence. The doctrine of false in one thing, false in all, has been rigidly applied, and those statements of the Masonic historian, which are fully reliable, have been doubted or rejected, because in other portions of this work he has been too easily deceived. Borrowing the technical language of science, we may say that the history of Freemasonry may be divided into two periods, the prehistoric and the historic. The former is traditional, the latter is based on documents. Each of these divisions must, in any historical inquiry, be clearly defined. There is also another division into esoteric and exoteric history. The first is entirely within the tiled area of the order and cannot be the subject of ordinary historical methods. By tiled area, I am presuming they mean in the secrecy of a tiled meeting, where things occur in Masonry that aren't to be shared with the public. The second properly comes within the sphere of historical study and is subject to all the laws of historical criticism. When we are treating of Freemasonry as one of the social organizations of the world, as one of those institutions resulting from civilization, and which have sprung up in the progress of society, and finally, when we are considering what are the influences that the varying conditions of that society have produced upon it, and what influences it has in turn produced upon those changing conditions, we are then engaged in the solution of a historical problem, and we must pursue the inquiry by historical method and not otherwise. We must discard all speculation, because history deals only with facts, unless it was rewritten. If we were treating the history of a nation, we should assert nothing of it as historical that could not be traced to and be tested by written records. All that is guessed of the events that may have occurred in the earlier period of such a nation, of which there is no record dating from or near that time, is properly thrown into the dim era of the prehistoric age. It forms no part of the genuine history of that nation, and can be dignified at its highest value with the title of historical speculation only, claiming no other confidence than that which its seeming truth or its likelihood commands. Now, the possibility or the probability that a certain event may have occurred in the early days of a nation's existence, but of which event there is no record, will be great or little as dependent on certain other events which bear upon it, and which come within the era of its records. The events may have been possible, but not probable, and then but very little or nor importance would be attached to it, and it would at once be put in the class of myths. Or it may have been both possible and highly probable, and we may be then permitted to speculate upon it as something that had exerted an influence upon the early character of the later progress of the nation. But even then, it would not cease to be a myth. Whatever we might assert of it would only be a guess. It would not be history, for that deals not in what may have been, but only of that which actually has been. Interesting, huh? What are they really speaking of here when they refer to nation? The nation of humankind? The progress in these later days of what are called the exact sciences is led, by the force of example and comparison, to a more critical examination of the facts, or rather the so-called facts, of history. Voltaire said in his Life of Charles VII of Sweden that incredulity that's tough. These old books use words that we don't often speak. Incredulity is the foundation of history. Oh, that's interesting. Voltaire said in his Life of Charles VII of Sweden that incredulity is the foundation of history. Years passed before that rule in all its force was accepted by the learned, but at length it has been adopted as the guide of all historical criticism. To be easily deceived is to be unphilosophical, and scholars accept nothing as history that cannot be proved with almost mathematical certainty. Niebuhr, 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 the historian, began by shattering all faith in the story of Rhea Silvia, of Romulus and Remus, and of their wolf mother. These curious stories, with many other incidents of the early Roman annals, were classed by him as myths. Well, those would be interesting things to look up. In later times, the patriotic heart of Switzerland has been made to mourn by the discovery that the story of William Tell and of the apple which he shot from the head of his son is nothing but fiction, a fable of the Middle Ages, and found in a great many countries, and the circumstances of which, everywhere varying in details, still point to a common origin in some early symbolic myth. That's also interesting. Yeah, I remember being taught about the story of William Tell as a kid, and I don't remember being told it was a myth. It is thus that many narratives, once accepted as truthful, have been, by careful study, removed from the domain of history, and such works as Goldsmith's Histories of Greece and Rome are no longer deemed fitting textbook for schools, where nothing but truth should be taught. And remember, this is 1898, right when there was a new truth about history that was being forced upon children of the time. And there's a lot of interesting information about the orphan trains, which suggests that after this last cataclysm in the mid-1800s, there was a significant loss of adult life, well, really human life in general, but that a lot of children were saved from the cataclysm. And they were placed on trains across the United States and Australia. Some estimate over 250,000 children. They were then dropped off in towns as the trains went along, and they were the reset population. They were taught the new history. They were the children that powered the Industrial Revolution. When we look at pictures of the Industrial Revolution, we see mainly children with a few overseer men with tall black hats and the hidden hand, inside their shirt thing going on, which a lot of researchers today think references some, mysterious, maybe, overlord group of people that were seen to the new paradigm. Well, it continues on. I kind of wanted to read this whole first chapter, but I think I've probably prattled on enough, and I think we've read enough to suggest that, this author, Mackey, is telling us right in the very first pages of his monstrous work, 7 giant volumes. They're all, this size. Look at that gorgeous book. Here's the spine of it. If I can get the camera to show it without too much glare. In the very first pages of this work, he's talking about that history is, chosen, that some early history books were decided to not be believable and so were discarded, and new history books were written that only treated in facts and truth. Kind of makes you wonder what those original history books were talking about. And now we look at artwork and books and coins and sculptures from the so-called medieval era, where we're told, for example, that the year is, say, 1386 on a given book or piece of art or coin, and the historians tell you it's 1386, so you buy it. It's Gothic, fancy script, looks a little weird, until it's pointed out to you that the 1 is not a 1. It's an I or a J with a dot on both sides, or sometimes just a dot after it, or sometimes no dots but a space between the I and the J and the other 3 letters. And it's curious that while historians will tell us that that date is 1386, in my example, yet at the same time, historians do admit that the I or the J with the dot means since the time of Jesus. So those documents, those sculptures and artwork or coins are not from the year 1386, they're from the year 386 since the time of Jesus. So there's a lot of evidence to show this, and Anatoly Fomenko, I'm sure most of you who would be watching this have been exposed to him. He published, I believe it's 7 books on the subject of 1,000 years being added to our history timeline. And Newton was the first to suspect this was the case, and in fact published 2 books on the subject. So it's been well recognized for a long time that there was 1,000 years added to our timeline. And why did they do this? They did it to push recent events into the distant past so that we wouldn't look at them closely. And what were those events? Well, they appear to be a period of repeating cataclysm. And so is this part of the history that Freemasonry is holding close to its bosom as a secret for us to discover? Or is Masonry part of the forgetting mechanism to fool us into thinking that this is some quasi-mystical, spiritual, make good men thing, kind of like a religion, but it's not a religion. It's like, if you're going to be a religious sort of person, you're going to go into a forgetting mechanism that is a religion. And if you're not so much religious, if you're just spiritual, if you will, then you might be drawn to a non-religious philosophical tradition like Freemasonry. So, I contend it's possible that there might be multiple of these forgetting mechanisms on the planet to sucker people into believing in, while not ever looking closely at, how did these things actually originate. One of the channels I like on YouTube is autodidactic, and the word autodidactic means to be someone that looks at original information and makes up your own mind what it means, instead of believing what your history teacher in college told you the stuff meant. And in fact, it seems to be part of the problem in both science and history today that if you go spend $500,000, or I don't know how much it costs, $250,000 on your doctorate education, well, by golly, you're going to put your back against the wall and you're going to insist that what you learned is the truth. You're not going to entertain any crazy, outlandish, speculative theories about our history or of science maybe existing in the past at the same level or maybe even greater level than it does today, because after all, you learned the paradigm and you believe it. So an autodidactic is someone looks at the original information and makes up their own mind. And when we look at pictures, our oldest photographs, there certainly seems to be some mysteries. For example, the photographs themselves. There appears to be an era of photos that are very high quality in the distant past, and then at the same time very poor quality photos, as if maybe the capability of photography had reached a high level before the last cataclysm, and then we lost that capability of photography and reinvented it at a basic level once again, and once again went through the process of learning how to improve our capability for photography. And we look at sculptures and paintings of the distant past, they're phenomenal. There's sculptures that look like they're 3D printed from like a photograph, if you will, a 3D photograph of the subject. Capabilities we don't have today. And there are grave sites in Europe, especially in Italy, I believe, where there's hundreds of spectacular sculptures over the most common person's grave, as if they brought on site a 3D printer and just printed these things out of marble. There's a lot more to say on this, and I'm sure most of you have been exposed to it on YouTube, or if not, I encourage you to do some searching and go down these rabbit holes. But the work people are doing today is phenomenal. And well, anyway, this just gets me back to the fact that Masonry might exist as part of this forgetting mechanism. By looking at like a very complicated collection of ancient mystery school traditions and spiritual messages. But that doesn't detract from the fact that Masonry does actually speak very clearly to a core set of secrets that aren't being hidden. And, well, I mean, they're hidden in our allegory and our symbols and in our ritual, but they are there to be found. So I also rather lean on the idea that maybe it was a group of smart people that wanted to preserve some of our knowledge at a time when it was being forcibly forgotten, if you will. And I rather more lean on that than Masonry being a forgetting mechanism. I think it very likely, there's an aspect of Masonry, I believe it dates to World War I, the Forget-Me-Not ceremony, and it has to do with, I forget the story, but I believe it was Masons during World War I, where they were being persecuted, who wore a forget-me-not pin, the flower, the forget-me-not, and that was their sort of hidden way of recognizing each other rather than using a square and compass symbol. It was a way to hide in plain sight. So Masonry has a history of hiding information in plain sight, and I really rather think that's what's going on, that Masonry is a message in a bottle from a previous era reminding us of our real past and who we really are. And who we really are is the enduring mystery of Masonry and its biggest secret. A secret because it can't be spoke of. And it has to do with the fact that the great architect, the great creator, God, if you will, expresses in an eternal now moment, in perfect, perfect perfection, that God expresses as perfection in this very moment, right now. And we don't pay attention to it. We pay attention instead to all the things that are changeable, instead of this constant singular aspect of awareness that unfolds constantly in our awareness as the creation of the great architect. And I think that is the real secret of Masonry, and it's not so secret, and it's available for everyone to experience for themselves. All one need do is look very closely at who you are, really with attention, with focused detail. Who am I? And identify that everything you thought you were is changeable. And if it's changeable, then that's not who you are, because you can choose to make those changes. So those things you are, I'm a web developer, I'm Michael, I'm a father. Well, I'm not a father, but all these things that you might think you are, well, you could change all those things so that you're the chooser, you're the one who's aware of those things, you're not those things. And by going through that process, really closely looking, I like to say, can you look for the looker? Look inside you. Can you find a looker? Because there is no looker. There is no inside. And by contemplating on this, awareness will occur. All right. Thank you, everybody. Please like, share, subscribe, comment down below. Watch my videos all the way through, even if you want to put them on mute because you don't like them. It'll help the Google algorithm. And hitting the thumbs up button helps. Hit the bell icon if you're so inclined to be notified when I publish. I have lots more interesting things to share. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.